Secretary General Stoltenberg, you're used to dealing with these sort of thorny issues ever since you took over as Secretary General of NATO in 2014, certainly tensions with former Soviet republics from that point onwards. You heard the Prime Minister's repeated pleas. They want more help. They don't just want words of support. Is NATO able and willing to offer them concrete help?
Yes, absolutely, and NATO and NATO allies are providing a concrete support. First of all, we have supported them for many years since 2014 with equipment, but not least many allies have trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian forces, and this proves extremely important now because many of these troops are now on the front line fighting the invading Russian forces. It's of course first and foremost the courage of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership that has stopped and slowed down the Russian invasion, but the support that NATO allies have provided with training and equipment since 2014 has proven to be extremely important in support of those efforts. Second, we have stepped up, so NATO allies are now providing more support, both military support, humanitarian support, and fiscal support or financial support. And then, of course, we are imposing unprecedented sanctions on Russia. And all of this is actually crippling the Russian economy. So the combination of concrete support and sanctions on Russia puts heavy pressure on President Putin and increases the reasons he will have to at some stage sit down and engage in good faith in diplomatic efforts. So yes, of course, NATO allies...
Do you really believe that these sanctions, though, will have that sort of impact, that they will compel President Putin to send back his troops in a week, in 2, or even 3, that these political pressures will go anywhere besides inflicting that economic cost, not just on the people of Ukraine, but on people around the world? Look at the rise in energy prices and the price of wheat around the world.
No one wants these sanctions. Of course, these sanctions are costly for the whole world, including for those countries which are imposing the sanctions. But at the same time, we have to react when we see Russia is blatantly violating international law, invading in a brutal way an independent sovereign country, Ukraine, and 140 nations at the UN condemned that strongly. NATO and NATO allies have imposed severe sanctions to put maximum pressure on Russia, and that increased the likelihood for them at some stage accepting that they have to sit down at the negotiating table. I agree with the Prime Minister that every war has to end at the negotiating table. The question is, how long do we have to wait for that? And therefore we put pressure on Russia, both by the sanctions, but also by providing support to Ukraine. They are on the front line, they are paying by far the highest price, but NATO allies and other countries all over the world are helping them, supporting them, including with military support.
But what do you say to those who believe that NATO, in fact, should take a large part of responsibility, of the blame, in letting the situation get to what it is today, in pursuing the alliance's provocative, many people would argue, so-called open door policy, bringing in more and more countries from Eastern Europe? The Russians have had it as a red line for a long time, preceding President Putin. You call this his war, but we know it has been well documented. Senior US officials and others have said it, that the rationale in Russia has been, and in the Soviet Union preceding that, that Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO was a major issue, that it could lead to this major conflagration. And here we are today. Don't you take part of the blame, in fact, a large part of the blame?
No, not at all. And just the idea that it is provocative, that the sovereign nations do what they want, just demonstrates a kind of completely wrong worldview that reflects. I'm coming from a small country, Norway, bordering Russia. And when we joined NATO back in 1949, Joseph Stalin and Russia, Soviet Union said that was a provocation. But I'm very glad that London, Paris, and Washington said, well, that's for Norway to decide. And we applied, and they accepted us. So this idea that big powers can decide what small neighbors can do, and if they do something they don't like, that's a provocation. You know, that's a world I don't want to live in.
But let's face it, this is the world we live in. Many see Ukraine as a pawn in a power big power struggle between the United States and Russia, let's face it.
But the question
is it a wise policy to continue to pursue?
No, but you speak as if NATO is moving east. No, it is independent. Slovenia is one nation, Norway is another, Poland, the Baltic countries. They have, through democratic free decisions, made their own choices and chosen their own path. And I think it's extremely important that we respect those free democratic decisions. If you start to reintroduce some kind of right for big powers to decide what neighbors can do, then we're moving backwards. Then we're moving into a world where we don't have free sovereign nations. Russia has subscribed to again and again, from the Helsinki Final Act to the Paris Accord, many other documents, that every nation has the right to choose own path, including what kind of security arrangements they want to be part of. We respect Ukraine when they want to join, but we also, of course, respect Sweden and Finland when they decide not to join. Russia should respect free and independent decisions by free and independent nations. That's all about.
But is it about respecting freedom and the sovereignty of nations? Because there is something called the Monroe Doctrine. Are you suggesting that the 200-year-old doctrine has ended, that the sphere of influence that the US said it also sort of has,
first of all, I don't think
doesn't exist anymore? Because let's imagine for a second that missiles were positioned, Russian or Chinese missiles were placed in Cuba or Mexico or Venezuela. What happens then?
Also, I'm not defending everything the United States have done throughout 200 years. I have been going in the streets of Oslo protesting against some of these wars. But the fact that one nation does something wrong in their history doesn't, in a way, excuse severe mistakes by another. So the whole thinking again that you have to start with the basics. The basic is, does an independent sovereign nation has the right to choose own path? Yes or no? If you start to question that, you move into a world which Russia now try to re-establish by using force. The Ukrainians are standing up against that. They deserve our support. We are supporting them, and it's really impressive to see the strength and the courage they are now demonstrating in the fight against this.
Briefly before I move on,
sorry.
Secretary General, briefly before I move on, what is the price of peace for you? As Secretary General of NATO, I know you don't hold all the decisions in your hand, but would you be willing to pay a small price by suggesting that NATO should not expand eastward, of course? And many see the potential membership of Ukraine in NATO as a fig leaf, not more. Are you willing to state that NATO should not expand any further?
So first of all, it is for Ukraine to decide, and I respect their decision whenever it's whether it's to join or not to join. Second, what Russia has proposed in the legally binding draft agreement for NATO is that we should sign an agreement with them stopping any further enlargement of NATO. And I think it was very interesting to listen to, for instance, Sweden and Finland. They're not currently applying for membership, but they came very strongly out against that idea, because for them that was to limit their options in the future. So this goes beyond Ukraine. What Russia is asking for is actually a ban on any further enlargement of NATO. And again, it's not NATO moving east. It's actually those countries, again, Slovenia, the Baltic countries, Poland, who have chosen to join our family. And this has been a great success. It has helped to spread freedom and democracy across Europe for several decades.
But the Russians are being more specific here in the case of Ukraine. They're asking for Ukraine to abide to the principle of neutrality, just like Austria was forced to after World War II. Yeah. Would that be a good idea?
But you said it forced to. Do we want to live in a world where big powers force small countries to do what they don't want to do? I said, that's not the world we like to live in. So the whole idea that it's a provocation for Russia that Ukraine does what they want to do is to turn the world upside down and violate fundamental principles, which also Russia has subscribed to. So it is for Ukraine to decide whether they want to aspire for membership. And then it is, of course, for 30 NATO allies to decide whether Ukraine is ready for membership. And it has been clear for a long time that membership for Ukraine was not something that was imminent, not something that was relevant in the near future. But again, this is about the principle of respecting every nation's right to choose their own path.
If it is the only way to stop the war tomorrow, is it worth considering? Yes or no?
But again, this is for Ukraine to decide. I support Ukraine's right to decide their own path, and then of course for 30 allies to decide when Ukraine is ready. And several allies have made it clear that this is not something which is relevant or on the agenda for the near future.
All right. Thank you, Secretary General.